This is TLV1.
Hi, this is Gilad.
And Dalia.
Before we start the show, we want to let you know about a very special event that will be taking place in London. That's for all of our UK listeners, and we know who you are. On the 6th of December, we'll be holding a live event where we'll be interviewing the acclaimed journalist Ian Black, the former Middle East editor for The Guardian. We'll be speaking about his new book entitled Enemies and Neighbours, Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel, 1917 to 2017.
The event will take place at City University at 6 p.m. It's a free event. Please join us. Check out our Facebook page for updates. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. We look forward to seeing you. The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Vandia Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dalia Rosenfeld. Yes, another Dalia, but without an H. She's a fiction writer and a journalist, and she teaches creative writing at Bar-Ilan University. Her short stories have appeared in The Atlantic, The Forward, the Michigan Quarterly Review, among other places, and she's currently writing a novel. But today we'll be talking about her recently published and critically acclaimed collection of short stories entitled The World We Think We Know. It was published by Milkweed Press in May 2017. Dalia Rosenfeld, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your stories and characters have many elements of a Jewish, American, Israeli life, not unlike your own, I suppose. But they're also characters who are tinged with loneliness, wandering in confusion, sometimes depression, yearning, longing, displacement. It seems to be those are threads that unite a lot of the stories. Were you trying, first of all, to tell a Jewish, American, or Israeli story? Or would you say your sort of first experience as a writer is universalist themes that can appeal to anybody?
That's a good and packed question, and let me try to unpack it now. I'm not often asked if I'm a Jewish writer because the question is not asked as often as it used to be a generation ago. But if that's part of the question you're asking, if I see my writing as fitting into the Jewish canon somehow, I feel a great sort of loyalty to the Jewish people outside the context of my writing. And inside the context, I sort of feel that my loyalty is first to language, whatever that means. And my characters are often triggered by sometimes just a single sentence, which then evokes an atmosphere, which then evokes a setting and a situation. And as far as my own biography, I'm a Jewish American, an American Jew, now an Israeli as well. And so I do feel that with these multiple passports, I sort of do represent the immigrant experience in a new way.
So immigrant experience, but it's interesting that you talk about where your work fits into the canon of other writers. I'm curious about who your influences are. I have to tell you my confession that when I first read the first story called Swan Street, I had in my mind a mixture of Proust, Swan's Way, and Street of Crocodiles by Bruno Schulz, because the name just created those associations. Who are the influences that you would say come out in your thinking, and maybe even somehow in your writing? Okay,
so I'm not always aware of how writers influence me. I know that they do because they influence all writers, but I remember reading Kafka's The Castle in high school and being extremely moved by a particular scene and calling my father immediately and asking him if he remembered the scene, and he didn't. And I thought, how such a scene ever be forgotten? And today, of course, I have no idea how to reconstruct the scene, but I just know that it changed the way I saw the world.
But we have to know which scene it was.
I know, and I can't remember. It sounds very Kafkaesque, but I can't remember.
Are you sure it wasn't the dream sequence where he has he's falling into sleep in the dream? That's what I remember from The Castle.
I remember that afterwards I didn't see the world the same way again. That's the impression it left me with.
What about, we talked earlier about the Jewish American experience and the Jewish canon. I'm trying to think where Israel fits into all of that. There are some references in the book to Israel, but actually, unlike Dalia, I didn't feel like it was oozing a Jewish atmosphere or Jewish themes.
I did not say oozing. I asked the question precisely because I think there's a good balance.
But that's how it felt. I thought that if I didn't know your story when I read, your identity when I read the book, I wouldn't be able to feel that it was particularly Jewish. But if you'd like to expand more on the issue of the Jewish identity of your characters, of your themes, but also flesh out where Israel fits into all that.
Sure. So I think the characters, many of them are Jewish. Many of the stories are actually set in Israel. And many of the characters are aware of some kind of collective past. And they like referencing that past in ways, usually not very erudite ways, because I feel myself, I know so little about things Jewish, but just ways to connect them to the past and to have a conversation with that past. So in the stories that are set in Israel, I'm not trying to convey a particular idea or message, but some kind of atmosphere. So there's a story set in Tel Aviv, and what conveys Tel Aviv for me is actually something that I observed recently, an ancient man being pushed in a wheelchair by an equally ancient man. And there was something about that I felt conveyed Tel Aviv.
But it's
not necessarily the Jewish experience, but maybe the Jewish experience, because again, there's this idea of, two friends taking care of each other, but that's again going it's stretched.
But do you feel that moving to Israel changed your perspective as an author?
Oh, for sure. Interestingly, many of the stories that I wrote set in Israel, I wrote from Charlottesville, Virginia, and now the stories I've written since moving to Israel are often set in small southern towns in America. So there's this sense of, again, dislocation and uprootedness that somehow I'm drawn to.
Or is it maybe that you need distance from a place to be able to sort of let that atmosphere sink in and see it from afar and write about it?
I think also, and to feel the longings for a particular place. We're often in a place, when we're in a place, we find that we'd rather be in a different place.
So do you feel that there's really an identity between the feelings that are yours while you're writing and those of the author? Is that like one of your methods as
Well, I try to actually distance myself very much from my own experience. I mean, maybe I'm conveying some kind of sensibility or understanding of human behavior, but I try very much to separate my own biography from the stories because I just feel that it hampers me to stay too close to my own
not
story.
so much a biography, but like the state of mind at a particular moment. I mean, you said that detachment. I mean, being far away from the place you're writing about, which is also a theme in many of your stories.
Yeah.
Is it like, do you need to feel detached and alienated to convey that detachment and alienation in your book?
It can't hurt, to be in conflict with your surroundings, right? To create the tension that is the stuff of fiction. I think it helps to at least imagine other people feeling that way if you yourself don't feel that way.
Well, it's interesting as we were talking about whether this fits into a Jewish experience or not. It's also true that many of the central characters are women, especially the first-person narrated stories. Is that conscious that most of the first-person narrations are women characters? And I don't think any of the first-person narrators are men. Is that true, or is there something?
I think that is true.
Now, why is that? Do you think it would be hard for you to step into the character of a man in the first person? This gets into all these debates now about whether a writer can really tell the story of another person who's not our identity, a very sensitive theme right now in terms of cultural appropriation.
Well, one of the stories in the collection is entitled Thinking in Third Person.
Absolutely.
And
That's the story that made me think of this.
And it's about a woman who tries very much to enter into the mind of a man and can't do it, keeps coming back to herself as a woman with unfulfilled longings. I'd like very much to be able to write from other perspectives, and I did write a few stories from the perspective of actually old men in third person. I'd like to try one in first person next.
Why do you think that you made your first attempt to sort of see from inside a man's perspective as an old man?
That's a good question. I think actually that's something that dates back 25 years when I was living in Jerusalem, and I was 18 years old, and my best friends were all German Jews in their 80s and 90s, and I felt a real kinship with them.
Why do you think?
It's something, a lot of them were Holocaust survivors, people who were familiar to me growing up in Indiana, of all places. My father is a Holocaust scholar, and he brought very interesting people into the house all the time. And I was never close to my grandparents, and maybe there was these were surrogate grandparents for me.
Issue of writing from a man's perspective as a female author reminds me, of course, of Amos Oz's great novel, My Michael, that was really groundbreaking at the time and got much acclaim for being able to write from a woman's perspective. What is your relationship to the Israeli canon? Do you have any influences among Israeli writers, books, novels?
Well, I loved reading Yaakov Shabtai, who died very young.
It appears in one of your stories.
Oh, yes, you're right. And Yaakov Shabtai led me to other writers. I really love Aleph Bet Yoshua's Facing the Forests, a novella, one of his earlier pieces, and also a lesser-known writer, Yoel Hoffman, who's more of an experimental, sort of minimalist writer. He's written some things that have been very influential for me.
What is it about the books that were so influential?
I think Israeli writers, and maybe this can be said for Jewish writers in general, I'm not really sure, but there's a great sense of irony I think, that I appreciated, and a sense of humor, sort of self-deprecating, which characterizes Jewish humor, and also a sense of place that I think is very hard to capture in writing. And again, because I was always reading about Israel from America, I felt this sense of longing very intensely while reading these authors.
Your longing was for Israel from America?
Yes, always.
So you had a vision of spending more time here and always wanting to come here?
Right, and I never thought it would happen in reality, and it did.
What is it like for an English language author who gets published mainly in the American publications for an American audience? Other than the detachment from the places that you write about, do you feel that you are also detached from your professional literary milieu? And how does that affect your work?
You mean living in Israel now?
Yes.
Well, I just live in constant fear that I'm going to lose the language. So I have a good community of writers here and allies in that sense, but only by virtue of subscribing to the New Yorker and the Atlantic do I feel connected with the language.
No, but isn't it like self-imposed exile that may undermine your creativity?
I certainly hope not. What's funny is that because writers need conflict to produce good material often, and here I feel utterly at home and not in exile, not uprooted, I thought, I'm going to be too well adjusted to ever write again. But that forced me to rely more on my imagination than on things that were happening in my own life.
Well, since you mentioned conflict, I feel like we have to ask. I mean, I'm thinking about the other fiction authors that we've had on the show, and actually all of them have dealt on some level with the conflict, from Dorit Rabinyan, who wrote about an Arab-Jewish relationship, and Asaf Gavron, who wrote about a sort of rogue settlement, and others that we've had.
Gwen Ackerman.
And Gwen Ackerman, of course, who wrote about an Israeli-Palestinian friendship between women. So I'm not saying, of course, that has to be the theme, but isn't the conflict so much a part of the backdrop, whether it's explicit or implicit in the Israeli mentality, and has that made an appearance in your writing yet?
I don't think it has consciously. I don't think it's penetrated the stories. Perhaps it's lurking there in the background somehow.
But certainly not explicitly in these stories.
Not explicitly. Perhaps implicitly. I haven't been aware of it. No one's pointed it out to me yet. It's something maybe I compartmentalize. So I'm very, very aware of the conflict and think about it a lot. But maybe I'm just not brave enough to tackle it in fiction, or maybe I don't want to merge this fiction with reality.
I'm not sure it has to be, by the way. I'm not saying
Yeah,
that.
sure.
I have to say, you remind me of the British film director Stephen Frears. I'll tell you why. Years ago, I went to one of his movie talks. I think it was the film festival in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And the whole theme of his self-deprecating, it was English after all, it was I was just there, I switched on the camera, and lo and behold, there was the film. I feel that when we were trying to analyze your writing, you're almost like taking a step back and talking about it also from a detached and a distanced perspective, just like your characters, perhaps. I mean, I'm trying to think why that is, why you treat your writing in a very matter-of-fact way, which is something that I have to say I'm not used to.
You thought it was going to be a big epiphany coming down from the sky.
I was hoping to get some sort of insight into the creative process. I'm not necessarily saying this as a criticism. Can you take us through your creative process? I mean, just pick a story at random.
Sure.
Perhaps Swan Street. That is wonderful.
First of all, I don't know if it's self-deprecating to say I turned on the camera and there was the movie, because I love the analogy that stories often write themselves. And I think there's a great truth to that. And maybe that's what Stephen Frears meant, right? I just turned on the camera and there was the movie.
Yeah.
So I like that. In terms of the impetus for a story, again, sometimes it starts with the setting, sometimes with the mood and atmosphere. Swan Street is a good example. I was living in Boston.
Tell us a bit about the story. Yeah.
It's about a new immigrant to America who, instead of settling in and starting a new life, he moves into a bed and breakfast and refuses to leave. So it's this idea of sort of the temporary versus permanence, and it was based on an encounter I had with a Russian Jewish immigrant in Boston, whom I met and asked him where he chose to rent an apartment, and in fact he didn't rent an apartment, he moved into a bed and breakfast, and I just thought that was such a strange thing to do. So I imagined this man never settling in. So again, in conflict with his surroundings, he wants to start a new life in America, but really never unpacks his suitcase.
No, but the beautiful thing about it is that it's told from the perspective of his estranged wife, who he essentially left behind and is actively cheating on.
Well, so she imagines him in America, starting this new life. and projects all kinds of things onto his character. So it's as much about her, of course, as it is about him.
And it's about a clash. It's also about a clash of old world and new, because she has this very old world thinking, and he kind of has it too, but he's in this completely new environment, and clash of worlds, I would say, in a way.
Yes, for sure. And there's no explicit reference to Russia except for the permanent frost beneath the soil that he left behind.
And also a country so big that it would take the sun half a day to
Exactly.
cross. Yeah, and I love that little phrase. When I'm asking about the creative process, the Russian scientist who moves into a bed and breakfast is all fine and well, but where did you get the idea to tell the story from the perspective of his estranged wife?
Oh, exactly.
That's the original
Right.
really thought-provoking aspect of the story, I think.
I think also because I was interested in exploring the sense of loss that she felt being left behind, and I could identify with that more than maybe somebody uprooting himself and, traversing half the world to get to this new place.
I want to go back to the story that you mentioned before, thinking in the third person. To my mind, that story is like a collage of perspectives, time, space, unfinished thoughts, a conscious mind jumping around to the fragments of things that are part of our daily reality. It feels to me almost like an impressionist painting or something. It's kind of messy in there. Was that an experiment for you, or is that actually something about the way you experience the world, or at least in moments, that you wanted to try to convey?
Well, I was told by a scholar that this was an exercise in metafiction, and he thought I pretended that I didn't know what that was when I asked what that was.
Oh, I was going to ask what that was, and I was not embarrassed to say I don't know.
Exactly, and I'm not either. I think it's sort of writing consciously about the writing process within a story. And
well, at least you didn't say, now I'm writing, which I can't stand personally. But
Right. But it's, again, about imagined worlds from the world in which we find ourselves, right? So the main character is in Tel Aviv during a sandstorm and imagining his wife in Chernovitz in Romania visiting her grandparents' graves, and just these great shifts in time and place and sensibilities.
And it's not just thinking in the third person, it's thinking in many different third persons.
Yes.
The narrators jump around.
Yes.
Does that get confusing for you during the writing?
It must. I just hope it doesn't translate onto the page.
Well, I think it does in a way, but it's an interesting confusion because in many ways I think it is how we experience life. If you're the kind of person who goes around and tries to understand who the people are around you.
And also it keeps us on the edges of our seats.
And it reminds us that life is so dynamic, especially in Israel. I mean, one day is so different from the next, and you never know what's going to come next. I'm one person. I mean, you have characters who sort of jump into that story for just a fragment of a sentence, but it reminds you, gee, that person that I might not have noticed, who's just a teeny little part of my life, is a full human being, even if I only see one little tip of that iceberg.
Did you experience any critics or reviewers or readers trying to compartmentalize you, writing about Israel and having moved to Israel as, a party to the ongoing debate?
I think I've been largely spared that, actually, being pigeonholed and identified sort of as part of just a niche community. So, no, reviewers have been pretty generous in that respect.
How do you explain that? I mean, you're one of the lucky few.
Maybe because I'm from the Midwest and not New York or California, so it's hard to stereotype me because I sort of have an interesting background. I don't know.
Where did this fascination with Israel come from? You started, as you said, writing about Israel in America, and now you've moved here. Tell us a bit about your Israel story.
Well, again, because I grew up in a small college town with very few Jews, and the Jews I did interact with were really mostly Holocaust survivors and other people my father invited to our house, I grew up with just a very eclectic identity. I was, one of the few Jewish kids in my school. And yet I had a very strong identity through the books in our house and through the people who came into the house. And then there were trips to Israel. We never went to Florida, never went to Disney World, but my parents took us to Israel.
You don't know what you're missing.
Yes.
Did you know that you were going to move here at some point? I mean, when did it dawn on you?
I think it just dawned on me when it happened, when I ended up extending my stay. And then here I am to tell the tale.
I want to hear about how Israel in general, but also your life, is going to influence your next project, which is your novel that you're working on.
Right. So the novel has become a second collection of short stories. And again, I've written about half the collection. And again, half the stories so far, half of the half, are set in Israel and half in America. So I'm staying with that setting. The themes are changing a little bit. The second book is not to examine loneliness at all, but more the concept of love love and its different manifestations.
So we're still looking at quite the personal. I mean, in other words, if we make some sort of a distinction, maybe it's an artificial distinction, between material that deals with the human struggle between individuals or within an individual versus an individual's interaction with, the public world or something, you're looking at the interior more?
I think so. People's inner struggles and the battles that they face just when confronting themselves as much as when confronting other people.
I'm intrigued by the fact that your second novel turned into a second collection of... actually, your first was supposed to be your first novel, turned into a second collection of short stories.
Yes.
What is it about short stories, the format itself? I mean, some of your stories are very short, like 4 or 5 pages long. Do you feel more comfortable writing short stories? Do you feel that your ideas for prose would just not make it? I mean, they are so compact that it would just not make a longer text?
I think a story ends when I felt that I've understood the characters I'm writing about, and sometimes these characters are purely imagined, and sometimes they're based on people I know, and sometimes they're a composite of the two. And I think when I feel that I've gotten to know them in the way that I set out to get to know them, then I don't need to expand. So in that sense, I'm not really trying to convey an idea that could be expanded in the form of a novel, but just a feeling, I think.
That's interesting. I think that goes back to what you said before, that your work is a lot about an exploration of the internal struggles of human beings. You're saying once I've captured the essence, once I've, as we say in Hebrew, yaradati ad sof hadea, like you've gotten to the bottom of who they are, it's enough.
I think so. I'm trying to lay bare contradictions that are within all of us. My friend Daniela read my collection and said, it's not a collection of stories, it's a collection of contradictions. And she meant that as praise, and I accept that.
Oh, maybe that should be the title of your next book, Collection of Contradictions. I like it.
There you go. See, this interview wasn't for nothing.
No.
All right, Dalia Rosenfeld, journalist and creative writing teacher at Bar-Ilan, a critically acclaimed author of the new collection of short stories called The Worlds We Think We Know. It was just published in English by Milkweed Press. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks again. It was a pleasure.
And also a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Fry and Carrie Shapiro and the Romai Foundation, who made a generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. That's right, you too can be a donor and have your name mentioned while also contributing to the survival of our podcast. If you want to do that, please write to Gilad at giald@tlv1.fm. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. We have about 350 interviews to keep you busy. You should listen to all of them. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel. And follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.